Good afternoon. I'm continuing today to talk about these claims that are made that critical scholars, or a majority of critical scholars, acknowledge these very helpful things last week, and this week I'm talking about authorship. In the interest of time, I'm not going to play this clip again, but I'm going to read a little part of a statement that Dr. Michael Licona made on the channel Potential Theist recently about authorship, and then he relates this to Jesus' bodily resurrection. The Gospels clearly present the tradition of Jesus as something where Jesus was raised bodily, physically, leaving behind an empty tomb. The majority of critical scholars today that write on the topic related to Mark say that the traditional authorship of Mark is correct and that Mark's primary source for his gospel was Peter. And then he says something about John that we discussed last week, and he continues, so you have eyewitness testimony that's carefully rooted, at least in Mark and in John, and these talk about the bodily resurrection of Jesus. In the case of Mark, it just means the empty tomb. All right, now, so is it true that, rather surprisingly, a majority of critical scholars today that write on the topic affirm the traditional authorship of Mark and affirm that Mark's primary source is Peter? No, not even based on the research that Dr. Licona appears to be relying on. Now, by using Dr. Habermas's book and by looking around in Dr. Licona's other own videos, I found what I take to be the research that lies behind this, or at least the closest you can get to it. A few years ago, Dr. Licona did a series of videos with an MA student of his named Joshua Pelletier, discussing Joshua Pelletier's master's thesis, which was essentially a literature survey of 207 scholars. And so this is, New Testament research, is reading a bunch of articles and then trying to catalog how many people who write the articles seem to be asserting this or that and getting statistics of that. Okay, so there are a lot of problems with this. I encourage you to go watch these videos with Dr. Licona and Joshua Pelletier. But the upshot, as we're going to see today, is that it is not true, even within that survey and the 207 articles that Pelletier read, that a majority of critical scholars affirm the traditional authorship of Mark and Peter as Mark's chief source. All right. The first thing that I really want to emphasize is critical scholars. Now, when you go to the video and you see how Joshua Pelletier defines his selection criteria, it's credentialed scholars, credentialed in a certain way. He said either a PhD in New Testament or in history. He said nothing about there being critical scholars beyond that. Normally, when somebody says a critical scholar, you take that to mean at least a scholar who isn't too conservative somehow. A scholar who's willing to approach the Gospels in some objective way. But just having a PhD in New Testament or in history isn't going to necessarily mean that. In fact, when Dr. Habermas represents this later, he says, it's this broad spectrum that includes conservatives as well as liberals, which may be true. But the fact remains then that there's a real question here, whether we're getting some kind of inflation of the meaning of this by taking it to be representative of critical scholars specifically. For sure, if you hear that as liberal scholars or non-conservative scholars or something like that, there appears to have been no such test applied. So you need to take that with a grain of salt, critical scholars. I'll just throw in here briefly, not necessarily writing today, writing from 1965 to the present. Since I was born in 1965, I kind of hate to point this out, but 1965 was 59 years ago. No, I haven't had my birthday yet, but still, Pelletier didn't want to cite people who were already dead by 1965, and he specifies that, but not necessarily writing today. That's relatively mild and minor, but critical scholars, Okay, now let's move on to this question whether it's a majority. Okay, even if that 207, whoever they were, whether they included conservatives as well. So I'm going to link below to this video and another one that Dr. Licona and Josh Pelletier did, and I want to thank Eric Manning again for helping me with some clips. I encourage you to go watch those whole videos if you think I'm taking something out of context here. I have tried to be really careful, but it just does not add up. Quite literally, it does not add up. So we're going to roll clip 1.
I haven't actually got the the quantitative data on this yet. I only have it on the chart. I haven't actually calculated the numbers precisely because I want to fine tune it a little bit. But looking at my chart without counting it or putting it in very specific numbers, it is quite obvious that John Mark is a majority opinion.
Okay, so that's Joshua Pelletier speaking. We can't say that Dr. Licona sort of imposes on Pelletier the idea that this is a majority, because he himself, just as they're getting into kind of adding up numbers, says that by looking at some chart that he has, it is quite obvious that John Mark is a majority opinion. Okay, so that's not just Dr. Licona's conclusion, that's Pelletier's conclusion. All right, but just to start with, not all of the 207 even gave their own opinion on authorship, and Pelletier carefully indicates that, but that's going to whittle down our number here. So this more than 200, not very exciting anymore, because it's going to be fewer than that who even gave an opinion. All right, so let's run clip 2.
3. So we're looking at 47 there, are kind of silent. They don't tell where they are on it. So 207 minus 47 is 160.
Okay, so only 160 gave their own opinion on the authorship of Mark. Well, okay, you say, is it a majority of that 160? So first, not clearly representative of critical scholars, however we define that. Second, the percentages do not apply to the whole 207. I'm sure that Pelletier had a reason to try to check those, that there was some reason to hope that they would comment, but not all of them did. Only 160 did comment on their own view. And now we're going to start trying to find out if it's even a majority of that 160 affirmed what Dr. Licona has said. So let's run clip 3.
So now we're at 80 divided by 160. So 50% would say pretty much the traditional authorship of Mark.
Yes.
Okay. Now, that's a big deal, and I encourage you, watch the minutes in between there if you want to. Licona comes up with 80, okay? 80 scholars. It's not 80%, that's 80 scholars who either said John Mark wrote the book, probably John Mark wrote the book, and I believe they also include plausibly, which I'm not even going to dispute. Okay, fine. Include John Mark wrote it, Mark wrote it, probably and plausibly, and that's 80. And Dr. Licona acknowledges that that's 50%. 50% is not a majority. 50% is exactly half. We also don't know how the ideological commitments fell out. Was it skewed were conservatives overrepresented among that 50% or whatever. We don't know that, but whatever, it's 80 scholars. It's half of those who commented on their own opinion, and less than half of the 207. So, I mean, that's a big deal. We've got a problem here because at that point, they've included everybody from Pelletier's various categories that they can legitimately include. And I haven't even contested including, probably, okay, fine, But where's this majority claim coming from? Now, in what follows, Dr. Licona asks if the remaining half deny traditional authorship. Okay? And Pelletier says, well, no, it's not like even the remaining half have this definite no opinion. And they continue adding things up and so forth. So some deny, and in fact, Dr. Licona concludes that 28% deny traditional authorship. All right, even without including those who have like some kind of ambiguous categorization. Now, at this point, I would like to play clip 4.
So I'm looking at 45, looks like, out of 160. So if I'm doing this, that'd be 28%. And then if you add the anonymous, that 14, it's 59 divided by 160. Then you're at 36.875 or 37%. So 50% would say, yep, traditional authorship of Mark. And then you'd have somewhere between whether you're going to include the anonymous gang in there. If you don't include it, it's 28% would say not the traditional authorship. It wasn't Mark. And if you include the anonymous in there, you got 37%. So by far, it looks like the majority position of critical scholars today would be the traditional authorship of the Gospel of Mark is correct.
Yeah.
All right, what just happened? What just happened? We went from 50% affirm traditional authorship to, by far it looks like the majority of critical scholars today would say that the traditional authorship of the Gospel of Mark is correct. And Pelletier says, yeah. We went from 50% to majority by far. What in the world just happened? Licona has admitted that 28% deny, 50% affirm, and then the remainder fall into ambiguous categories, such as saying that possibly John Mark wrote it, and they quite rightly don't count that, or that it is anonymous. We know that Bart Ehrman plays a kind of Mott and Bailey game where he'll say that the Gospels are anonymous, using that in this narrow technical sense, but then Ehrman really means and really thinks that they are anonymous in a stronger sense, that for a long time nobody knew who had written them. I'm not saying Ehrman's included in this survey. I don't know, maybe he is, but I'm just saying that that's a possible way of using the word anonymous. And I think Pelletier admits that, it's kind of ambiguous how you count this. So the point is that only 50% affirm, and that's only 50% of the 160 who gave an opinion on authorship. They can't get any higher than that. I mean, there's none of these others can be rightly counted as affirming it. You've got affirming it, denying it, and then saying ambiguous sounding things, and then people who didn't give any opinion at all. Okay, so I'm sorry, but no, this is just terrible. How did that get translated into by far the majority? Now, I have a theory here. for what it's worth. It's the only thing I can really think of as to how Dr. Licona and Joshua Pelletier became confused about this. I think plausibly they are confusing a majority with a plurality. What do I mean by a plurality? Well, suppose you have more than 2 categories. I'll give a quick example. Suppose you have a survey of 20 people and you ask them to check a box concerning their political affiliation. All right? And the 4 boxes they can check are Democrat, Republican, Independent, and prefer not to say. Okay? And let's suppose 8 check Democrat, 5 check Republican, so that's 13, okay? And 4 check Independent, okay? And so now we're up to 17, and 3 check prefer not to say. The single category that got the most check marks was Democrat. So that's the plurality. That's the single category that got more check marks than any other single category. But when you have more than 2 categories, being the category that got more than any other one category does not make it the majority. You see, 8 was not a majority of 20. And just as here, 80 is not a majority even of 160, much less of 207. I think they must have looked at it and seen that some kind of affirmation of John Mark is the author, probably John Mark, plausibly John Mark is the author, was the single category that got more things, more articles that Pelletier was interpreting as saying that than anything else that they could group together similarly, and then said, it's a majority. And that's not a majority. What's sort of inexcusable about this, though, is that just right there, Licona said 50%. And I mean, a majority is supposed to be at least above 50%, even a bare majority. So we're not even at a bare majority. So it's pretty inexcusable, especially since then Dr. Licona is going to go on repeating this elsewhere. But, okay, there's another video where they do a similar adding up thing concerning scholars who say that Peter was a source. I'm going to link that, but for the interest of time, I'm not going to try to go into that in as much detail. The bottom line there is that they came up with the same survey, same set of articles, 95 scholars who say that Peter was, some kind of source or other. Now, as we discussed last time concerning John, how far behind is Peter lying here? I don't mean lying like not telling the truth, but how far behind is he? Are there layers over top of it? Remember that Licona said carefully rooted. And they're, not saying that it's necessarily carefully rooted, even when they're saying that Peter is a source, but that's still only 95 scholars. Okay, so that's not a majority of the 207, and since the maximum you could have would be limited by the 80 that affirmed traditional authorship, even if all of those also affirmed that Peter was a source, you're still, for the conjunction of traditional authorship and Peter was a source, 80 is the best you can get. Okay, and that's what Licona is saying is a majority. So, the most exciting number would be 95 scholars out of the 207 surveyed who might or might not have been critical scholars, we don't know how many or how those were represented in the 95, said that Peter was some kind of a source behind the gospel. So, and 95, of course, isn't even half of 207. And that's even when we're kind of abandoning the conjunction of Petrine sourcing and Markan authorship and just going with the higher number of some kind of Petrine sourcing. Still not even half of the 207. And that becomes important because this gets worse. All right. What I've just said is pretty serious error, representing half of those who commented as a majority. But it gets worse because this information then got passed on to Gary Habermas and represented in his new book that just came out on the resurrection, and further errors crept in. So I want to read some of the things that Habermas says about this very research on page 552 of his new resurrection book. For instance, a recent survey of a broad cross-section of contemporary critical New Testament scholars, there's that word critical again, revealed that a majority considered Mark to be the original author of the gospel that bears his name. That's on page 552. Then we have a footnote. In this MA thesis, Pelletier surveyed over 200 New Testament scholarly works of liberal, moderate, and conservative persuasions regarding various stances on the Gospel of Mark. More scholars than not favored the traditional authorship of John Mark. Now, did you hear that? All right, now I'm gonna read another quote. This is from Habermas, page 563. As just mentioned above, a recent survey of over 200 contemporary New Testament critical scholars indicated that the majority view was that Mark was the author of this gospel and that his chief historical source was the Apostle Peter. I'm not even going to quibble about chief historical source, which, we don't hear stated anywhere. I'm going to zero in on what's most egregious here. Habermas did not apparently get the information that even the percentages that Habermas and Pelletier were, Licona and Pelletier were calculating were not percentages of the 207. That quite a few of the 207 did not give their own opinion. So Habermas is directly representing that the majority view among the more than 200 scholars that Pelletier read was this conjunction. I mean, that's bad. I mean, we got another really big error that is just crept in here. It's simply false. He didn't get the information that a significant number didn't comment on their own opinion, and he didn't get the information that even of those who said what they think, even among that 160, only half affirmed traditional authorship. So you cannot have more than half of the 207 affirming traditional authorship and Petrine sourcing. It's not more than half of the 207. It's not even more than half of the 160. This is not good, and this just made it into a major, brand new scholarly work. All right, this is why we don't measure scholarly works by how much they weigh on your coffee table. We evaluate them based on the quality. And then there's this really weird thing that I'm going to read from Habermas. This comes into one of the quotes that I read after he says more scholars than not favor the traditional authorship. He says, more specifically, almost exactly 80% also favored Peter being Mark's primary historical source or as having some other sort of influence on the writing of the gospel. Frankly, I am left just guessing where in the world almost exactly 80% came in here, because we're not even at 50% of the 207, and we're only at 50% of the 160. What's 80% of what? Your guess may be as good as mine, but for sure it isn't 80% favoring the conjunction. I don't know where Habermas got this almost exactly 80%. It's a confusingly written passage, and in all of the things I've been able to come up with, it's just adding another layer of error to all of this. But I'm just commenting on that briefly. The biggest bottom line is that Habermas asserts unequivocally that the majority view among a survey of more than 200 scholars was the conjunction. It was written by John Mark. and his chief historical source was the Apostle Peter, page 563, and that is false. It's just outright false. We got to do better than this. The intense desire among evangelicals to say that we are using what is admitted by a majority of critical scholars has betrayed some of our most prominent apologetic leaders into serious scholarly mistakes. These mistakes are then published and restated by others, and they pass into what is taken for fact. As Christians committed to truth, we must do better. I want to challenge us to do better, and that's why I'm explaining these things. Please don't go out there and state the majority of critical scholars grant traditional authorship of Mark, and that Peter was the main source, and that the Gospel of Mark is carefully rooted in eyewitness testimony. None of that is true. I'm sorry. But fortunately, we can just say that critical scholars are wrong, and we can just straight up argue that, because we're going to have to do so in the end anyway. I haven't decided what I'll be doing next week, but please come back and we'll find out then. Thank you for watching. I'm Lydia McGrew.